The year was 1958. A young pollster named Lloyd Free walked into a small diner in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, clipboard in hand, ready to ask Americans a simple question. Do you trust your government to do what is right? 9 out of 10 people said yes. They trusted their president, their Congress, their courts, their military, their schools, their doctors, their newspapers. Trust was the invisible foundation upon which the entire American experiment rested. Fast forward to today. Walk into that same diner, if it's still there, and ask the same question. You'll be lucky to find 2 out of 10 people who say yes. Something catastrophic has happened to the American psyche over the past 65 years. The most trusted nation in human history has become a country where citizens view their own institutions with the same suspicion they once reserved for foreign enemies. But this isn't a story about politics or partisanship. This is the story of how a nation systematically destroyed the very thing that made it great. The belief that institutions, however imperfect, were fundamentally working for the common good. And the price America is paying for this collapse is higher than most people realize. It began with a lie. Not just any lie, but perhaps the most consequential deception in American history. On August 2, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson stood before Congress and the American people, his voice heavy with the weight of impending war. He told them that North Vietnamese forces had launched an unprovoked attack on American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The attack, he insisted, was real, brutal, and demanded immediate military response. Except it never happened. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the event that would justify America's full-scale entry into the Vietnam War, was largely fabricated. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara would later admit that the supposed second attack on August 4th was probably never occurred. The NSA's own historian concluded decades later that the incident was 90% mythology. But by then, 58,000 Americans were dead, and something far more precious than lives had been lost. The presumption that when the government spoke, it was telling the truth. The revelation didn't come immediately. For years, Americans watched their sons and brothers return in body bags from a jungle on the other side of the world, fighting for reasons that seemed increasingly unclear. The disconnect between official optimism and brutal reality became impossible to ignore. General William Westmoreland would appear on television, promising that victory was just around the corner, while Walter Cronkite's cameras showed the charred remains of American soldiers being loaded onto helicopters. Then came the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Daniel Ellsberg's leaked documents revealed that the government had been systematically lying about Vietnam for years. Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon had all known the war was unwinnable, yet continued sending young Americans to die rather than admit failure. The sacred covenant between government and governed, that even if policies failed, leaders were at least honest about their intentions, lay in ruins. But Vietnam was just the beginning. Before the shock of government deception could fully settle, Americans were hit with an even more devastating blow. Their own president was a criminal. The Watergate break-in on June 17, 1972, seemed like a third-rate burglary at first. 5 men caught rifling through Democratic Party files at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. It might have remained a footnote in history, except for 2 young Washington Post reporters who refused to let the story die. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein followed the money, traced the connections, and slowly unraveled a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. President Richard Nixon, the man Americans had twice elected to lead them, had not only known about the break-in, but had actively participated in covering it up. The smoking gun tape, released on August 5, 1974, captured Nixon's voice ordering the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. For the first time in American history, a president resigned in disgrace. But the damage went far beyond one man's fall from grace. Americans had discovered that their president, the person they had entrusted with their nuclear codes, their sons' lives, their constitutional freedoms, was capable of treating the law as his personal plaything. The trust index, that simple measure of faith in government, plummeted from 77% in 1964 to just 36% by 1974. but even that number would prove optimistic. The 1980s brought a different kind of betrayal. America had always prided itself on having institutions that, whatever their flaws, operated according to clear rules and moral boundaries. That changed with the Iran-Contra scandal, a web of illegal arms deals, secret wars, and constitutional violations that made Watergate look simple by comparison. The story reads like a spy novel. Reagan administration officials secretly sold weapons to Iran, America's sworn enemy and designated state sponsor of terrorism, then used the profits to fund a guerrilla war in Nicaragua that Congress had explicitly forbidden. When the scandal broke, it revealed a shadow government operating completely outside democratic oversight. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, testifying before Congress in his crisp Marine uniform, became the face of this new reality. He spoke of shredding documents, lying to Congress, and subverting the Constitution with the casual confidence of someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him. Most disturbing of all, many Americans cheered him for it. The hero was no longer the person who followed the law, but the person who broke it for a good cause. President Reagan himself claimed ignorance. Either he was lying about one of the most significant foreign policy operations of his presidency, or he had lost control of his own government. Neither possibility was reassuring. The Iran-Contra affair established a precedent that would haunt American institutions for decades. When caught breaking the law, claim noble intentions and wrap yourself in the flag. Then came the savings and loan crisis, a financial catastrophe that perfectly illustrated how institutional decay spreads from government to the private sector. Throughout the 1980s, savings and loan associations, the community banks that helped build the American middle class, became vehicles for spectacular fraud and mismanagement. The crisis wasn't the result of market forces or economic cycles. It was the predictable outcome of deregulation combined with government guarantees, a toxic combination that privatized profits while socializing losses. Bank executives looted their own institutions, making risky investments and outright fraudulent loans, knowing that federal deposit insurance would protect depositors while they walked away with millions. When the dust settled, American taxpayers were on the hook for $124 billion in today's dollars. More than 1,000 savings and loan institutions had failed. Entire communities lost their local banks, their savings, and their faith that the financial system was designed to serve ordinary people rather than enrich insiders. But the true institutional betrayal came in the aftermath. Despite clear evidence of widespread fraud, fewer than 1,000 people were prosecuted, and most received light sentences. The message was clear. If you stole millions through complex financial schemes, you might get a few years in minimum security prison. If you robbed a convenience store for $50, you'd get a decade behind bars. This two-tiered justice system, one set of rules for financial elites, another for everyone else, would become a defining feature of modern American institutions. And it was just getting started. I'm curious, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Are you someone who still has faith in institutions, or has your trust been shaken by personal experience? Drop a comment and let me know. Your stories help shape how we tell these important historical narratives here at Professor Archive. The 1990s brought a temporary reprieve from institutional collapse, fueled by economic prosperity and the end of the Cold War. Americans had jobs, their 401k accounts were growing, and the Berlin Wall had fallen. For a brief moment, it seemed like the system might be working after all. But beneath the surface, the forces of institutional decay were accelerating. The Clinton administration faced its own credibility crisis with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, though this time the betrayal felt more personal than institutional. Americans could understand a president lying about his personal life, even if they didn't approve. What they struggled with was the spectacle of impeachment proceedings that seemed more about political theater than constitutional principle. More damaging was the increasing polarization of institutions that had once been viewed as nonpartisan. The Supreme Court's decision in Bush versus Gore, which effectively decided the 2000 presidential election, marked a watershed moment. For the first time in modern history, the highest court in the land was seen by roughly half the population as a partisan actor rather than an impartial arbiter of law. Justice John Paul Stevens, in his dissent, captured the moment's significance. Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. But the real hammer blow to institutional trust came on September 11, 2001. Not because of the attacks themselves, Americans rallied around their institutions in the aftermath, with trust in government briefly spiking to levels not seen since the 1960s. The damage came from what happened next. The weapons of mass destruction that justified the invasion of Iraq didn't exist. This wasn't a case of faulty intelligence or honest mistakes. It was a systematic campaign of deception that made the Gulf of Tonkin incident look subtle by comparison. Secretary of State Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations, later called a blot on his record, used fabricated evidence to make the case for war. The cost was staggering. Over 4,400 American military deaths, more than 30,000 wounded, and estimates ranging from 100,000 to over 1 million Iraqi civilian deaths. The financial cost exceeded $2 trillion, but the institutional cost may have been even higher. Americans had been told once again that their government would lie them into a war that would define a generation. The pattern was becoming clear. Institutions would make catastrophic mistakes, suffer no meaningful consequences, then demand the same level of trust and deference they had possessed before their failures. This cycle of betrayal without accountability was eating away at the foundations of American democracy. The 2008 financial crisis completed the transformation. Here was institutional failure on a scale that dwarfed even Iraq. The nation's most prestigious banks, regulatory agencies, and credit rating firms had collaborated to create a financial bubble based on fraudulent mortgages and deliberately misleading investment products. The human cost was devastating. 9 million families lost their homes to foreclosure. 8 million people lost their jobs. Retirement accounts worth $2.4 trillion simply vanished. The median household wealth of African American families fell by 53%, Hispanic families by 44%. Entire communities were destroyed, leaving behind empty houses and broken dreams. But here's what made the crisis so damaging to institutional trust. The same people who caused the catastrophe were put in charge of fixing it. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, demanded $700 billion from taxpayers to bail out his former colleagues. The Federal Reserve, which had failed to prevent the bubble, was given sweeping new powers. The credit rating agencies that had rubber-stamped fraudulent securities faced no meaningful punishment. Most infuriating of all, virtually no one went to jail. Despite clear evidence of fraud at major banks, the Justice Department decided that these institutions were too big to jail. The message to ordinary Americans was unmistakable. The system was rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful, and their government was actively participating in the rigging. Eric Holder, the Attorney General who made these decisions, would later join a prestigious law firm where he defended the very banks he had chosen not to prosecute. The revolving door between government and Wall Street spun so fast it made observers dizzy. This wasn't just institutional failure, it was institutional capture. The agencies meant to regulate finance were staffed by people who had worked for financial firms and would return to them after government service. The rules were written by the regulated for the benefit of the regulated. Democracy had become a largely cosmetic exercise, while the real decisions were made in boardrooms and country clubs. The rise of social media in the 2010s accelerated the collapse of institutional trust by democratizing information and misinformation. For the first time in history, anyone with an internet connection could bypass traditional gatekeepers and speak directly to millions of people. This had profound implications for institutions that had relied on their role as information intermediaries. Newspapers, which had served as democracy's watchdogs for centuries, found themselves competing with conspiracy theorists and partisan bloggers for readers' attention. Television news networks discovered that opinion shows generated higher ratings than straight reporting, leading to the rise of infotainment disguised as journalism. The business model that had supported serious journalism Advertising revenue from classified ads in department stores migrated to Google and Facebook. Local newspapers, which had covered city councils and school boards, closed by the hundreds. Between 2005 and 2020, more than 2,100 newspapers shut down, leaving vast news deserts where citizens had no professional coverage of local government. Into this vacuum stepped amateur investigators, partisan activists, and foreign governments running influence operations. QAnon, a conspiracy theory claiming that a secret cabal of pedophiles controlled the government, gained millions of followers. Pizzagate convinced a North Carolina man to drive to Washington, D.C. with an assault rifle to investigate a child trafficking ring supposedly operating out of a pizza restaurant. These weren't just isolated incidents of internet-driven madness, they were symptoms of a deeper problem. When people lose trust in traditional institutions, they don't stop believing in explanations. They believe in alternative ones. And alternative explanations, unconstrained by professional standards or factual accuracy, can be far more compelling than boring reality. The COVID-19 pandemic became the ultimate stress test for American institutions, and they failed spectacularly. The Centers for Disease Control, the premier public health agency in the world, fumbled its initial response so badly that it actually made the crisis worse. The CDC's first coronavirus test kits were contaminated and didn't work. The agency then insisted on developing its own tests rather than using successful models from other countries, causing a crucial delay in testing capacity. When the tests finally worked, the CDC sent conflicting messages about mask wearing, social distancing, and the basic facts about virus transmission. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the government's top infectious disease expert, became a polarizing figure not because of his scientific expertise, but because of his inconsistent public statements. He told Americans that masks weren't necessary, then that they were essential, then that they should wear 2 masks, then that vaccinated people didn't need masks, then that they did in certain circumstances. Each reversal, however scientifically justified, eroded public confidence in expert guidance. State governments imposed lockdown orders that seemed arbitrary and contradictory. Churches were closed while liquor stores remained open. Small businesses were shuttered while large corporations stayed operational. Protests against lockdowns were condemned as dangerous superspreader events, while protests for social justice were celebrated by the same public health officials who had demanded isolation. The result was predictable. Americans stopped listening to public health authorities altogether. Mask wearing became a political statement rather than a medical precaution. Vaccination rates varied dramatically by political affiliation. The United States, with the world's most advanced medical system, had one of the worst COVID-19 death rates among developed nations. But the real institutional breakdown came with the 2020 election and its aftermath. President Donald Trump's claims that the election was stolen represented something unprecedented in American history. A sitting president using the power of his office to undermine faith in the electoral system itself. Trump's claims were investigated by his own Department of Justice, rejected by courts at every level including judges he had appointed, and contradicted by Republican election officials in key swing states. But facts seemed irrelevant to the millions of Americans who had lost faith in traditional sources of information. The January 6th attack on the Capitol was the logical endpoint of institutional collapse. When people stop trusting elections, courts, and media, violence becomes the only remaining way to resolve political disputes. For the first time since 1861, Americans used force to try to overturn the results of a democratic election. The images from that day, Confederate flags in the Capitol Rotunda, lawmakers hiding behind barricaded doors, police officers being beaten with American flagpoles, represented the complete breakdown of the civic norms that had held the country together for more than 2 centuries. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of January 6th was how quickly it was normalized by a significant portion of the population. Within months, the violent attack on democracy was being reframed as legitimate political discourse by the Republican National Committee. The police officers who defended the Capitol were called crisis actors. The mob that chanted "Hang Mike Pence" was recast as peaceful protesters. This wasn't just political spin, it was the complete abandonment of shared reality. When institutions lose the ability to establish basic facts, democracy becomes impossible. You can't have democratic debate when people can't even agree on what happened. Today, American trust in institutions has reached historic lows. According to Gallup polling, only 11% of Americans have confidence in Congress, 27% trust the Supreme Court, and 16% trust television news. Even the military, long the most trusted institution in American society, has seen its approval ratings drop to 64%, the lowest level since Gallup began tracking military confidence in 1975. Young Americans, who have lived their entire lives during this era of institutional failure, are particularly disillusioned. They've never known a time when government agencies were competent, financial institutions were trustworthy, or media organizations were credible. For them, cynicism isn't a choice, it's a survival mechanism. The consequences of this trust collapse extend far beyond politics. When people don't trust institutions, they make individual decisions that collectively harm society. They don't get vaccinated because they don't trust public health agencies. They don't save for retirement because they don't trust the financial system. They don't participate in civic life because they don't believe their participation matters. This creates what sociologists call a trust trap. Low trust leads to poor institutional performance, which justifies further distrust, which makes institutions even less effective. It's a vicious cycle that's extremely difficult to break. The economic costs alone are staggering. A 2017 study by the consulting firm McKinsey & Company found that institutional trust directly correlates with economic growth. Countries with high trust levels grow faster, innovate more, and have lower transaction costs. The erosion of trust in America has likely cost the economy hundreds of billions of dollars in reduced productivity and increased verification costs. But the human costs may be even higher. Research by Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam shows that low social trust is associated with higher crime rates, worse health outcomes, lower educational achievement, and reduced economic mobility. When people don't trust institutions, they withdraw from society, creating a spiral of isolation and civic decay. Perhaps most dangerously, the collapse of institutional trust makes America vulnerable to foreign manipulation. Russia's interference in the 2016 election wasn't primarily about hacking voting machines or changing vote tallies. It was about exploiting existing divisions and undermining faith in democratic processes. When Americans don't trust their own institutions, they become easy targets for foreign propaganda operations designed to weaken democratic governance. So how did America get here? The story we've told tonight suggests several contributing factors. First, institutions repeatedly betrayed the public trust through deception, incompetence, and self-dealing. From Vietnam to Iraq to the financial crisis, American institutions consistently prioritized their own interests over the public good. Second, there was never meaningful accountability for these failures. The same people who caused problems were put in charge of solutions. The same institutions that failed were given even more power and resources. This created a moral hazard where bad behavior was rewarded rather than punished. Third, the information environment changed in ways that made institutional credibility harder to maintain. Social media democratized information sharing, but also democratized misinformation. Traditional gatekeepers lost their monopoly on public attention, forcing them to compete with more entertaining but less accurate sources. Fourth, economic inequality made institutional failure more visible and painful. When everyone was prospering, people could overlook institutional incompetence. But when the benefits of economic growth flowed primarily to elites, while ordinary Americans saw their living standards stagnate, institutional failure became personal. Finally, polarization made it impossible to maintain nonpartisan institutions. Everything became political, including agencies and organizations that had previously operated above the partisan fray. When Republicans don't trust Democratic-led institutions and Democrats don't trust Republican-led institutions, the very concept of neutral expertise becomes meaningless. If you've made it this far in our exploration of America's trust crisis, you might be feeling pretty pessimistic about the future. And honestly, you should be. The problems we've discussed tonight don't have easy solutions, and they're getting worse, not better. But here's the thing about history. It's full of moments when everything seemed hopeless, when institutions seemed permanently broken, when the future looked dark. America has rebuilt trust before, and it can do so again. But only if people understand how we got here and commit to doing the hard work of institutional repair. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the historical events that shaped our world. If you found today's exploration of America's trust crisis enlightening, I'd be grateful if you could show your support with a super thanks. It really helps keep these long-form historical investigations coming. The path forward isn't mysterious. It requires institutions to actually serve the public interest rather than their own. It demands accountability when institutions fail. It needs leaders who tell the truth even when it's politically costly. It requires citizens who are willing to participate in civic life rather than retreat into cynicism or conspiracy theories. Most importantly, it needs Americans to remember that institutions are not abstract entities. They're made up of individual people making individual choices. Every time a government official chooses honesty over convenience, every time a journalist chooses accuracy over ratings, every time a citizen chooses engagement over withdrawal, the foundation of trust gets a little stronger. The America of 1958, where 9 out of 10 people trusted their government, is gone forever. But the America that could replace it, more transparent, more accountable, more responsive to genuine public needs, might be even better. The question isn't whether America can rebuild institutional trust. The question is whether Americans are willing to do the work required to earn it. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of the most important stories of our time. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep holding institutions accountable. That's how democracy survives.